At the end of last month's episode of Detective Comics, we saw the League of Assassins getting ready to attack the Organ family while their ship was about to dock in Gotham Harbour. But don't worry folks, because this month Batman swoops in and saves the day. Well, he kind of saves the day until he gets injured during his battle with Ubu, Talia's henchman, and ends up having to be saved by his old pal Jim Gordon and his new sidekick, the Kid. We also discover that the Organ family is able to buy back their ancestral home, Arkham Asylum, and currently they're working in cahoots with Batman's old foe, Two-Face, who, surprise surprise, is also the star of the backup feature that follows the main story, which once again revolved around Harvey's own internal battle with himself. Now, all in all, I didn't mind reading this book because the art was appropriately atmospheric and the story presented us with several interesting scenarios, like Batman's sudden mental dip, for instance, which could either be caused by his own anxiety or the demon of Barbatos, as well as the battle between the Organs and the Al Ghuls, which presently seems fairly even-handed, although I'm pretty damn sure the best is yet to come. But then again, that kind of defines this issue to a T, as I'm sure the best is yet to come, because so far this story comes across as a bit of a slow burn, but it still shows a lot of promise. Are you a fan of wrestling, especially old school American wrestling? Well, if so, then I'm pretty damn sure you're going to get a right kick out of this issue of The Flash, issue 787. Not only because the vast majority of this story consisted of a series of nicely illustrated fight scenes, mainly between Wally and several intergalactic wrestlers, but in addition to this, it was also funny. I loved it when Omega Bam referred to Wally as the Flasher. Self-contained, unlike the rest of this run, this story is only one issue long rather than a multi-part crossover event, and it was peppered with a number of celebrity cameos, ranging from comic book characters like Nightwing, Lobo, and rather surprisingly, Maul from the Wildcats, all the way to comic book versions of sporting legends like Hulk Hogan, Jerry Lawler, and Gene Okerlund. More importantly though, this story also conveyed a very touching message about the value of family, as well as the need to look after your own mental health in spite of overwhelming work commitments. Which, in my opinion, is a very poignant message to convey, as I for one genuinely feel that some people need to break free from repetitive behaviour and just try something new. Now, the one thing about this story I wasn't too keen on was how its initial conceit was easily pushed to one side. After all, the notion that a multiversal wrestling tournament can accidentally crash land on Earth does seem like a big deal. But in this case, said accident wasn't treated as a big deal and was quickly explained away in one single panel, almost as if the final payoff was more important than its initial setup. So far, I've enjoyed reading this current iteration of The World's Finest because I love the way Mark Waid has reinvented the dynamic between Dick, Bruce, Clark and Kara, as well as how he's prioritised his stories to focus on character and plot rather than ideology or political messaging. In this case though, well, even though I love the art and all of the main characters, particularly Dick,
why does that sound rude?
In the same breath, the actual story left me wanting more. More what? I'm not entirely sure. Not totally, anyway. As on the one hand, I was impressed with how Mark has once again managed to elevate a fairly simple pretext by giving it a new spin. One that involved the Justice League villain, the Key, infecting the people of Gotham by giving them entomatophobia, the crippling fear of doors and windows, which has left most of them unable to leave their homes, their vehicles and their places of work, not unless someone comes rushing in to save the day. While, on the other hand, this great part of the story was most probably why I'm slightly uncertain if I enjoyed reading it or not, as initially it did detract from this current story arc, only slightly mind you, because I presumed it was about a new troubled hero named David Scalila rather than a scenario where a villain decides to cause mischief in a fairly innovative way. Now please don't get me wrong, as I'm not trying to say that David's story didn't progress in a more positive direction. What I am trying to say though is that I would have preferred a less impactful segue that didn't dilute what was initially built up last month. Apart from that though, on the whole, this book is still a lot better than many other comic books out there, and despite this one minor flaw, the art was great, the story was interesting, and I can't wait to see what happens next. Now, to be entirely honest with you, I had a tough time trying to figure out which comic book should come higher on my list out of this one, Daredevil issue 4, and the previous one, The World's Finest issue 8, because they're both pretty decent books, and unfortunately they suffer from one fundamental flaw, which in this case has to do with the overall structure of this story rather than its focus or direction. Well, when it begins, we're presented with a series of establishing scenes that seem somewhat reminiscent to the 1967 film The Dirty Dozen. Saying so because Matt Murdock, acting as a sergeant major, introduces his troops, which is to say the newly recruited members of the Fist, to each other, their mission and their eventual objectives, all the while recounting what happened in last month's episode and what will hopefully happen next. But then, halfway through, the narrative shifts gear and shies away from a simple introductory tale in favour of a mystical initiation, or should I say a bizarre wedding ritual, with Matt and Elektra becoming the king and the queen of the Fist after having to take part in a strange supernatural battle where they have to vanquish a horde of zombies in order to seal their union. Well, I suppose it saves going to church and exchanging marriage vows, and just think of how much money you can save on catering, wedding venues and all of that malarkey when all you have to do is kill a couple of corpses instead. Anyway, as I was saying, this sudden shift in the story is the only thing I have against it. Not the art, as I thought that was great, not the story itself, as that was fairly intriguing, but the shift, the sudden shift from the first part of the plot to the second part of the plot, which in many ways kind of made it into an episodic story of two equal halves. At the end of last month's episode, we saw Superman prevent Failsafe from taking Batman's life when he and the Justice League showed up to defend their friend from all of the recent chaos. But will they be able to stop Failsafe once and for all? Or will Green Arrow, Black Canary, Martian Manhunter, Hawkgirl and the Man of Steel fall flat on their collective faces? Well, to cut a long story short, no, they don't stop Failsafe, but they do save Batman and Superman from his arduous attacks. First, by taking them both to the Justice League's jet, and then by instructing Robin to fly the two of them to safety. Which he does, in part, as Batman decides to bail out of the jet just before they reach their final destination, the Fortress of Solitude, so he can tend to his injuries, lay low for a while and delay any more attacks on his allies. Well, those were his initial intentions anyway, but he didn't know that it would take him over 2 weeks to fully recover thanks to Aquaman and his fishes, which unfortunately gave Failsafe enough time to overpower his enemies and become the new King of Gotham. Now, I've said it before, so I will say it again. This current Failsafe story arc is bloody amazing. As the art was bold, dynamic and lively on the page, the action scenes were nicely choreographed and easy to follow, and overall, this story is really suspenseful. So much so in fact, that it kind of reminded me of Terminator 2, Judgment Day. But instead of the story being about saving the life of John Connor, it's focused on Batman, the Dark Knight detective, and instead of Sarah Connor and Terminator 1 saving John's life, the saviours are the Justice League and the Bat family. Although, I suppose the only difference between the two is that in this comic book, its version of the Terminator comes from the past as opposed to the future, and for the time being, ultimately wins. Actually, while I'm on the subject of the past, I'd like to mention the backup feature inserted at the back of this book, because it's set in the past and appears to revolve around the origins of the Batman of Sir N.R. although I could be wrong, as this supplementary story does seem to zigzag all over the place, yet I'm still loving its intentions as well as its Dick Sprang inspired artwork. Lovely stuff.